Elena woke up on March 12th, 1943 at exactly 4:17 in the morning, and the very first thing she felt was the vibration beneath her bed. It was like the earth itself was trembling, like something deep underground was waking her on purpose. For a moment she didn't move. She just lay still, staring at the cracked ceiling above her as dust drifted down in soft little clouds. Then came the second explosion, louder than the first, shaking the walls of the tiny room and rattling the metal frame of her cot. That's when she knew the front line must have shifted again. That meant more wounded, more chaos, more long hours. She pushed the thin blanket off her legs and sat up, rubbing her eyes, trying to force her mind awake even though her body was still begging for sleep. The air smelled of smoke. It always smelled like that now. Smoke, blood, and antiseptic. She had gotten used to it in a strange way. She slipped her boots on quickly, tying the laces with practiced fingers, even while her heartbeat sped up from the distant booms echoing through the valley. She didn't bother fixing her hair. There was no point. Within minutes, it would be messy again from running around the hospital. She splashed cold water on her face from the metal basin beside the door. The water was freezing, but it shocked her awake enough to stand tall and breathe deeply before stepping outside her room. The hallway was dim, only a few lanterns hanging on rusty nails. She walked fast, boots clicking on the wooden floorboards, past the rooms where sleeping soldiers groaned from nightmares. Some whispered in their sleep. Some cried. She heard it every night and every morning. She wished she could help them all, but dreams were wounds she couldn't reach. She was halfway down the hall when she heard the sharp voice of Dr. Radanovic calling her name. Elena, get ready. They're coming in fast. That voice snapped her into full focus. She quickened her steps, pulling her sleeves higher and rolling her shoulders back. She entered the treatment room, and the doctor pointed toward the back table. Prepare everything. We're going to need it. She nodded and hurried toward the shelves. She grabbed bandages, gauze, morphine, scissors, thread, clean cloths, anything useful. She arranged them all on the table as fast as she could, wiping her hands on her apron in between movements. She heard shouting outside, soldiers calling for stretchers, boots stamping on frozen dirt. The chaos was growing louder by the second. The doctor rushed past her with his sleeves already rolled up, muttering something about lack of supplies. Elena didn't complain. She knew they would have to make do with whatever they had. They always did. Minutes later, the first wounded were carried in. 2 soldiers she recognized immediately. She had treated them before, and now they were back with fresh injuries. One of them had a deep cut across his arm, and the other had burns across the left side of his face. She moved toward them quickly, placing a calming hand on one soldier's shoulder as he gritted his teeth in pain. She whispered to him softly, telling him he was okay, that he was safe now. She always tried to speak gently because she noticed something about soldiers. Even the strongest ones relaxed when someone talked to them like a human being instead of like a number on a chart. The room filled up fast. More stretchers came through the door. More shouts filled the air. Elena worked nonstop. She cleaned wounds, stopped bleeding, held trembling hands, wiped tears, and murmured words of encouragement. Her fingers moved skillfully, threading needles, tying knots, pressing bandages, checking pulses. She barely had time to breathe. The explosions outside didn't stop. Sometimes they shook the building so hard a few nurses stumbled. But Elena didn't stop. When she was younger, she never imagined she would spend her life surrounded by blood and fear. She once dreamed of working in a quiet hospital in a quiet town, where children with scraped knees and old women with fevers came to see her. But the war shattered every peaceful dream she had. So she decided she would at least try to bring peace to the people she treated. Hours passed like minutes. Soldiers kept arriving. Some cried her name because they trusted her more than the doctors. Others just stared at her with glassy eyes, too weak to speak. She saw men younger than her, boys barely old enough to shave, arriving with injuries no one their age should ever see. The worst part was when she saw the fear in their eyes. It was the same fear she saw every day. Fear of pain, fear of dying, fear of never going home. She tried to hide her own fear, but deep inside, she was terrified too. Not of dying, but of failing them. By mid-morning, The hospital floor was a mess. Boots left muddy footprints. Blood drops stained the wooden boards. Used bandages piled up in buckets. Nurses ran from room to room, their aprons reddened, their hands trembling from exhaustion. Elena felt her legs aching, but she didn't slow down. She kept going, treating one soldier after another, moving quickly between cots. The doctor passed by her and said, "We're running out of morphine. Be careful with how much you use." She nodded and continued, giving smaller doses, whispering apologies to the soldiers, who clenched their jaws to endure the pain without complaint. The explosions grew louder again, closer. The windows rattled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Everyone glanced nervously at the doorway, expecting another wave of wounded. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She could sense it. The war was crawling closer. She wrapped another bandage, straightened another blanket, and prepared more tools. Then she heard shouting from outside, somewhere near the gate. The voices sounded panicked. She looked toward the door, and a moment later, a soldier burst in, breathing hard, his face pale. He said words nobody was expecting. "There are enemy wounded outside. 3 of them. They're badly hurt." The room fell silent. The doctor froze with his hands halfway inside a medical kit. Another nurse whispered something under her breath. An officer standing near the door clenched his jaw. The news hit everyone like a sudden gust of icy wind. Enemy soldiers, right outside their own hospital, injured and helpless. On any other day, soldiers like that would have been taken away or left behind. But today they were lying outside the very place meant to save lives. The officer spoke first. "We don't have supplies for them. We treat our own first." His tone was sharp, final. The doctor nodded reluctantly, agreeing that they were too overwhelmed. But Elena felt something twist inside her chest. She imagined the 3 wounded young men lying outside. She imagined them scared, in pain, maybe calling for help, maybe thinking they would die alone. Something inside her couldn't accept that. She stepped forward without thinking. "I will treat them," she said quietly. Everyone turned toward her. The officer frowned. "You can't. They're the enemy." Elena looked him in the eyes and replied simply, "They're human." The doctor sighed deeply, torn between logic and compassion. "Elena, it's dangerous. You don't know what they'll do." She shook her head. "They're wounded. They won't hurt anyone." The officer stepped closer. "You're risking your life. You understand that." She nodded again. She didn't hesitate. She had already made up her mind. She grabbed her medical bag and walked toward the entrance. As she stepped into the cold air, the ground beneath her boots felt uneven from the morning's explosions. Smoke drifted across the yard, mixing with the faint scent of pine trees in the distance. The sky was gray, heavy with the threat of more attacks. She rounded the corner and finally saw them, 3 enemy soldiers lying on the ground. When she approached, they flinched. One tried to crawl away. Another lifted a shaky hand as if to shield himself, and the third stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. They had clearly expected punishment, not help. Up close, she saw how young they were. One couldn't have been older than 18. Their uniforms were torn, soaked with blood, covered in dirt. Elena knelt beside them slowly, so she wouldn't frighten them. In a calm voice she said, "I'm here to help you. You're safe." Even though she spoke in her language, the tone of her voice softened their fear. They relaxed just a little, enough for her to start working. She examined the first boy. He had a deep wound in his side, blood flowing too fast. She pressed her hands on it, applying pressure. He groaned in pain, and she whispered, "Stay with me, you're okay." Then she moved to the second soldier, whose leg was broken badly. She touched the injury gently and apologized when he cried out. The third boy had breathing problems, likely from a chest injury. She checked his pulse, which was frighteningly weak. She looked around, hoping for help, but none came. Soldiers watched from afar with worry and confusion. They didn't know whether to assist her or stop her, but her focus was entirely on the boys at her feet. She tore strips of fabric from her own uniform to make bandages, because she had run out of cloth. She cleaned their wounds using the little water she had left. She breathed slowly, tried to keep her hands steady. Their eyes followed her movements, slowly shifting from fear to trust. Suddenly gunfire cracked in the distance. Loud, sharp, close. Soldiers shouted for her to get down, but she didn't move. She positioned her body between the wounded boys and the open field, as if she could shield them. The officer from earlier rushed to her side, grabbed her arm, and demanded to know why she was risking her life like this. She answered him with the same calm voice she had used with the wounded boys. "If we stop being human, then the war has already won." The officer stared at her, stunned. Soldiers watching from the doorway grew quiet. Even the wounded boys seemed shocked by her words. And that was the moment everything began to change. It was 6:45 in the gray cold light of the ruined city when Elena stepped into the shattered hospital that had become her world, a place where the walls still echoed with explosions from the night before and where the ground trembled slightly beneath her boots from distant artillery, like a heartbeat reminding her that danger was never far away. Even though she barely slept, her mind instantly shifted into focus because every second mattered here, and every pair of hands meant the difference between someone living or dying. She walked past the broken windows, covered with plastic sheets that flapped softly in the draft, and she felt the sting of smoke in her eyes as she approached the triage area, where wounded soldiers, civilians, and even prisoners of war were being brought in constantly. She knew that in this place there was no time to think about sides or uniforms or flags, because the only thing that mattered was the pulse she could feel beneath her fingers, the shallow breathing of a man who had lost too much blood, the trembling hand of a scared young soldier who looked far too young to be fighting in a war he didn't understand. As she moved through the crowded space, she could hear the moans, the cries, the whispered prayers in different languages and dialects, sounds she had grown used to but never fully numb to because each one reminded her how fragile life was in this war. She lifted a clipboard from a table that was stained with dried blood and quickly scanned names and conditions, but there were so many entries, so many injuries, that she simply placed it down again and trusted her instincts, as she always did, letting her feet carry her from one patient to the next. She crouched beside a man with shrapnel lodged in his throat, his breaths ragged and fading, and she pressed her hand gently against the wound to slow the bleeding. She felt his fear, and without thinking she murmured that he would be okay, even if she wasn't entirely sure herself, because in moments like these the truth mattered less than hope. She called for a medic to bring more bandages and kept pressure on the wound as she prepared him for surgery, her hand steady even though her heart raced, because she had seen enough soldiers die in her arms to know how close he was to slipping away. When the medic arrived, Elena stood up, wiped the sweat mixed with dust from her forehead, and moved on to the next patient because the flow never stopped, and she had trained herself to keep going without hesitation. She stepped into the next room where the smell of antiseptic barely masked the scent of blood, and she found a young boy, no older than 12 or 13, sitting on a cot with a deep cut across his arm. She knelt in front of him and spoke softly, asking his name, but he didn't answer. His eyes were wide and empty, the look of someone who had seen too much. She cleaned the wound, applied disinfectant, and wrapped a bandage with gentle hands, knowing that the physical injury was the least of what he was carrying. When she finished, she told him he was safe for now, but even as she said it, she could hear gunfire growing closer outside, and she wondered how long they could keep pretending that safety existed within these thin hospital walls. As she stepped out into the hallway, she saw 2 stretchers being rushed in, one carrying a soldier from her own side, the other carrying an enemy soldier. Their uniforms were stained the same shade of crimson, their faces twisted in the same agony, and for a moment Elena felt the weight of the war pressing on her chest, because scenes like this reminded her how meaningless borders felt in the face of human suffering. Without hesitation, she went to the enemy soldier first because he was closer to death, and she could see the panic in his eyes as he realized he was being treated by someone from a side he had been taught to fear. She held his gaze and told him she was here to help, that he was safe, her voice firm and calm even though she knew reassurance was difficult in a place where fear lived in every shadow. She worked quickly, cutting away the uniform soaked in blood, checking for exit wounds, calling for morphine, her hands moving with precision and speed because she knew time had become her greatest and cruelest enemy in this war. Once his breathing stabilized, She stepped over to the soldier from her own side, a man she recognized from previous battles. His leg was shattered, bone exposed, and he gritted his teeth against the pain as she cleaned the wound and prepared him for surgery. He looked at her with desperate eyes and asked if he would survive, and she told him yes, because she refused to let doubt creep into her voice. He exhaled shakily and nodded, trusting her more than he trusted the commanders who sent him into battle. She squeezed his hand before stepping away to allow the surgeon to take over, and as she turned to leave, she could hear him whisper a quiet thank you. She made her way toward the supply room to restock her kit, but when she opened the cabinet, she found it nearly empty. Bandages, antibiotics, painkillers, everything was running dangerously low. Her chest tightened because she had seen what happened when supplies ran out, and the memory of makeshift splints and crude cloth strips haunted her. A nurse approached her, breathless, telling her that a convoy with medical supplies was supposed to arrive that morning, but had not been heard from since radio contact was lost. Elena didn't say anything at first, but she felt a chill run through her, the kind that told her something had gone wrong. She knew better than to dwell on the thought, because she couldn't afford to freeze. She grabbed what little supplies remained and walked back into the hall, where the flood of wounded continued. Hours passed without her noticing, the light shifting from dim gray to a harsher brightness as the morning sun finally pushed through the smoke outside. Her hands were stained, her arms trembling from exhaustion, but her mind refused to slow down. She moved from patient to patient, stitching wounds, administering injections, comforting the dying, comforting the living, holding the hands of men who begged her to send messages to their families, promises she knew she might never have the chance to fulfill. She cleaned burns, splinted broken limbs, lifted unconscious bodies, and every action felt like a small battle she fought against the overwhelming tide of destruction outside. Through the broken doorway she saw a group of soldiers bringing in another stretcher, and she braced herself for the sight of more devastation. But when they placed a man down, she froze because she recognized him instantly. He wasn't one of theirs. He wore the uniform of the enemy air division, his insignia faded and torn, his face smeared with soot and blood. She remembered treating men like him before, men who had bombed the very streets she walked each morning, men whose machines had cast shadows over this hospital more times than she could count. But she also remembered the way their faces looked once the uniform was stripped and the injuries were all that remained. Just people, scared and hurting, not so different from the men she grew up with. She knelt beside him and checked his pulse, weak but steady. His breathing was shallow, his eyelids fluttering as though he was trying to wake, but couldn't. She examined the burns across his shoulders and chest, the deep gash along his ribs, the wrist that bent at an unnatural angle. As she worked, she heard a murmur from a nearby nurse questioning why they were treating someone who likely attacked their own city just hours before. Elena didn't look up. She simply said what she always said, that suffering doesn't stop at borders, and that if they start choosing who deserves to live, then they are no longer healers, but something far worse. The nurse fell silent after that and continued assisting her, handing her gauze, securing the wound, starting a transfusion, and together they worked until the soldier's breathing steadied and some of the tension eased from his face. When she stepped back, she wiped her forehead again, trying to catch her breath, but her moment of stillness didn't last because a sudden explosion shook the building, dust falling from the ceiling, lights flickering. People screamed, nurses ducked, windows rattled. For a second the entire hospital seemed to tilt, and Elena grabbed onto the edge of a table to keep from falling. She instinctively ran toward the entrance, knowing more wounded would be pouring in, her legs moving even though her body screamed for rest. Outside, the sky was blackened with smoke once more, and the sound of aircraft overhead sent a cold shiver down her spine. But she didn't stop. She simply pulled her mask over her face, tightened her gloves, and ran toward the chaos, because this was the only way she knew how to fight back. It was 11:10 later that same day when Elena stepped outside the hospital for the first time since sunrise, and the moment the smoky air touched her face, she felt as if she had stepped into a different world, a world that was louder, harsher, and more unpredictable than anything inside those fragile walls. The sky had darkened again with a heavy mix of storm clouds and rising smoke from burning buildings in the distance, and each breath carried the metallic taste of dust and ash. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck and started walking toward the supply trucks that were supposed to arrive hours earlier, but had never made it, her boots crunching over shattered glass and debris scattered across the street. She could hear gunfire echoing faintly from somewhere beyond the ruined square, but she kept moving because she knew hesitation could cost lives inside the hospital. She passed by the remains of a shopfront whose windows had been blown out days ago, and she couldn't help noticing a child's toy lying in the rubble, a small wooden car, scorched on one side. She paused for just a second, her chest tightening with the familiar ache of knowing how many innocent lives had been swallowed by this war, then forced herself to keep walking because dwelling on sorrow never helped anyone survive. She made her way toward the abandoned intersection where the convoy was supposed to arrive. The streets felt unnervingly empty, the kind of silence that didn't comfort but warned, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Elena scanned the area, her instinct sharpening, aware of every sound, every movement, every shifting shadow. She could see the distant trail of tire marks cutting across the dirt, leading toward the outskirts, and she began following them slowly, hoping that maybe the vehicles had simply taken a different route or stopped due to engine trouble. But as she approached the next block, she found something that made her stop completely. One of the convoy trucks was there, but not in motion. It had crashed into a lamppost, and its windshield was shattered, smoke still drifting from the engine. Her heart dropped. She hurried toward it, calling out, hoping someone inside might still be alive, and when she reached the door, she yanked it open only to find the driver slumped over the wheel, unmoving, his uniform stained with blood. She felt her throat tighten, but she checked his pulse anyway, hoping for a miracle, and when she found none, she closed her eyes for a brief moment before forcing herself to continue. She looked around and found tracks leading away from the truck, footprints mixed with drag marks indicating wounded people had been pulled from the scene. She followed the trail carefully through an alleyway littered with broken bricks and fragments of a collapsed roof. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and she began to hear faint voices in the distance, men calling to each other, the rustle of movement, the shifting of equipment. She slowed her steps, her heartbeat quickening, because she knew there was a chance the convoy had been ambushed, and that whoever was responsible might still be nearby. As she reached the edge of the alley, she peeked around the corner, and immediately froze. There were enemy soldiers gathered around the remaining convoy trucks, rummaging through crates, shouting orders, loading supplies onto their own vehicle. Her stomach twisted because these supplies were meant for her hospital. The bandages, the antibiotics, the oxygen cylinders, everything they desperately needed to save lives. Seeing them being taken away felt like watching hope slipping through her fingers. She ducked behind a crumbling wall and took a moment to steady her breathing. She knew she couldn't fight them. She wasn't armed, and even if she were, it wasn't in her nature to take a life. But she had to do something, because returning to the hospital empty-handed wasn't an option. As she crouched there, listening to the voices, she tried to think of a way, any way, to take back at least part of the supplies, or at the very least figure out where the enemies planned to take them. She scanned the area carefully and noticed that one of the crates had been placed near the edge of the broken pavement, partially hidden behind an overturned barrel. If she was careful enough, if they were distracted for even a few seconds, she might be able to grab some of it. She waited, listening for the right moment, hearing the shuffle of boots and the clang of metal as the soldiers loaded the supplies. Then suddenly a distant explosion thundered from the direction of the city, and the soldiers immediately turned toward the sound, some rushing to take defensive positions, others simply stunned by the shockwave. Elena knew that was her chance. Without thinking further, she darted forward, keeping her body low, her breaths quick and shallow as she reached the crate. Her hands trembled slightly as she pried it open just enough to reach inside and pull out several rolls of bandages, a handful of syringes, and 2 small bottles of antibiotics. It wasn't much, barely enough for a day's worth of emergencies, but it was something, and in her world, something could mean survival. She stuffed them into her bag and quietly slid the crate back into place, then moved backward slowly, trying not to make a sound. But just as she turned to slip away through the alley, She stepped on a shard of broken tile that cracked loudly under her boot. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but in the tense quiet of the moment it felt like a gunshot. She heard a voice behind her shout something in a harsh tone, and suddenly footsteps were rushing toward her. Her heart leapt to her throat as she sprinted back through the alley, her breath burning her lungs, her mind racing. She could hear two soldiers chasing her, the sound of their boots growing louder as she turned the corner sharply, narrowly avoiding a pile of fallen bricks. She kept running, her legs aching, her mind focused on nothing but getting back to the hospital, because she knew that if they caught her, she would not only lose the supplies, but also risk being captured or killed. She reached the main road and ducked behind an overturned vehicle, pressing her back against the metal as she tried to calm her breathing. She could hear the soldiers shouting behind her, searching, moving through the rubble, their voices echoing off the hollow buildings. She stayed perfectly still, praying they would lose her trail. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, their voices began to fade, and she slowly leaned forward to peek around the edge of the vehicle. The street was empty again. She exhaled shakily and forced herself to stand, her legs trembling not just from exhaustion, but from fear she hadn't fully processed yet. She tightened straps of her bag and began walking quickly back toward the hospital, her senses still sharp, her eyes scanning every movement, every shadow. When she finally reached the hospital entrance, one of the nurses ran toward her, breathless with worry, asking where she had been because another wave of wounded had arrived while she was gone. Elena didn't answer right away. She simply reached into her bag and began unloading the supplies onto a table. The nurse's eyes widened when she saw what Elena had managed to bring back, even though it wasn't much. Elena just nodded, trying to catch her breath, and told them they needed to ration everything carefully because she wasn't sure when they would get more. Then, without even giving herself a moment of rest, she turned toward the triage room, where she heard someone calling her name urgently. As she walked inside, she found the enemy soldier she had treated earlier now fully awake, sitting up slightly on his cot. His face was pale, his breathing still shallow, but his eyes were open, alert, and fixed on her with a strange mixture of confusion and gratitude. He tried to speak, his voice cracked and rough, and she leaned closer to listen. He asked why she had saved him, why she had treated him the same way she treated her own people. Elena hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer felt too heavy, too personal. She finally told him that a wounded person is not her enemy, that suffering strips away uniforms and flags, leaving only a human being in need. He looked at her for a long moment, as though trying to understand a kind of kindness he had never expected to receive in a place like this. As she prepared fresh bandages for him, he watched her closely, and then quietly said that she shouldn't have gone out earlier, that the area had been too dangerous. Elena paused, taken aback that he somehow knew she had been outside, and he explained in a whisper that he had overheard soldiers talking before he lost consciousness, warning that the supply convoy was a target. She didn't know why he was telling her this, or why he seemed genuinely concerned, but something in his voice made her realize he wasn't just another soldier to be treated and forgotten. There was a story behind his eyes, one she didn't know yet, one that seemed to carry weight and regret. She finished dressing his wounds and told him to rest, but as she walked away she couldn't shake the feeling that this man, this enemy soldier, might become far more important to her than she ever imagined. She didn't understand why she felt that, but something in the quiet way he watched her, something in the worn edges of his voice, told her that fate had just shifted in a way she couldn't yet see. And even though the hospital was still filled with chaos, injuries, and endless demands, she found herself thinking about him as she moved on to the next patient, wondering what he had lived through, wondering what he knew, and wondering why she felt the faintest pull toward him even in a place swallowed by war. The moment everything changed began around 3:42 in the afternoon, when the hospital wall shook again, not from a direct hit but from something powerful exploding somewhere nearby. Elena was in the middle of stitching a deep wound on a young soldier's shoulder when dust rained from the ceiling and the lights flickered. Everyone inside froze for a second, their breaths caught between fear and exhaustion. The soldier on the bed looked up at Elena with wide, panicked eyes, but she placed a steady hand on his chest and told him to breathe, her voice calm in a way that didn't match the chaos around them. She finished the last stitch, wiped her forehead, and looked toward the entrance, where shouting had begun to rise again, loud and desperate. 2 medics burst into the room, carrying another stretcher, but this one looked different. The man on it wasn't from Elena's side. He wore the dark gray uniform of the enemy, his arm twisted unnaturally, blood soaking the cloth on his thigh. The sight caused a ripple of tension to sweep through the ward. Some soldiers pushed themselves up on their beds. Others muttered angrily under their breath, and one even spat on the ground in frustration. Elena didn't react. She simply walked toward the stretcher because she knew that a wounded person was a wounded person, and nothing else mattered. But before she could reach him, another explosion boomed outside, much closer than the last, shaking the building so violently that the lantern hanging from the ceiling swung like a pendulum. The windows rattled, and several patients cried out in fear. The medics placed the enemy soldier on an empty cot and stepped back, anxious, because treating someone from the other side in the middle of heavy fighting felt like playing with fire. Elena examined his injuries quickly and called for supplies. She worked fast, blocking out the angry whispers around her, blocking out the way a few soldiers stared at her with disbelief. She focused only on keeping him alive. As she tightened a tourniquet on his leg, he stirred and opened his eyes just enough to see her face. For a brief moment their eyes met, and even though he was barely conscious, she could see something in his expression, gratitude mixed with confusion, maybe even guilt. He tried to speak, but no words came out, only a pained gasp. She told him not to talk, and continued working. Minutes later a loud cry rose from outside the hospital entrance. Elena's head snapped up, along with everyone else's. Several people ran toward the doorway, voices overlapping, fear rising. Something was happening. She handed the bandages to one of the medics and rushed outside to see for herself. The sky had darkened further, not from nightfall but from smoke so thick it almost looked like storm clouds drifting low. The sound of gunfire echoed from the edge of the main street, and soldiers were gathering behind a cluster of sandbags placed for cover. Others were dragging injured comrades back toward the hospital. The fighting was getting closer again, much closer than earlier. Elena felt a cold sensation crawl up her spine because she knew what that meant. If the battle reached the hospital, there would be no safe corner left. She spotted Commander Asher, the man in charge of protecting the hospital perimeter, shouting orders to the troops. He saw Elena running toward him and waved her back urgently, telling her to get inside. But she stopped in front of him and asked what was happening. He wiped sweat and soot from his forehead and told her that the enemy was advancing from 2 directions. Their lines had weakened earlier in the day, and now both sides were pushing closer than ever. The hospital stood between them, a fragile building caught directly in the path of violence. Elena felt her stomach twist. She asked him if they had enough men to hold the line, and he hesitated before saying they would try. That single word, try, made everything inside her tighten with fear. A sudden shout came from the far side of the barricade, followed by a series of gunshots. Soldiers ducked, returned fire, and the sound of bullets cracking against stone echoed through the ruined street. Elena instinctively crouched, her heart pounding. She grabbed the edge of the barricade and saw dust kick up where bullets struck the ground only a few meters away. Commander Asher pulled her by the arm and pushed her behind a large overturned vehicle, telling her again to get back inside. But she shook her head and pointed toward 2 injured soldiers lying near the barricade, still exposed. Without waiting for permission, she sprinted toward them, ignoring the commander's angry shout. Her legs pushed harder than they had all day as she reached the first soldier. He was bleeding from a wound on his side, too weak to move. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward cover, dragging him inch by inch. His uniform was soaked with blood, and he groaned in pain, but she kept moving. When they reached the safety of the vehicle, she helped him lie down, then immediately ran back for the second man. The gunfire grew louder, sharper, and she could hear bullets ricocheting off the metal near her. But she reached the second soldier too, pulling him as fast as she could, her breath burning her chest. Just as she dragged him behind the barricade, another explosion thundered nearby, sending a wave of dust and pressure that knocked her off her feet. Her ears rang, and for a moment she couldn't hear anything except a muffled hum. She forced herself up and looked toward the street. Something strange was happening. The shooting had suddenly slowed, replaced by shouting from both sides. Confusion rippled through the soldiers. Commander Asher peered over the barricade, trying to understand the sudden pause. Elena stood next to him, clutching her medical bag tightly. Through the smoke, she could see figures moving cautiously, their shapes blurred by dust. Some were from her side. Some wore the dark gray uniforms of the enemy. They weren't firing. They weren't advancing. They were just standing there, watching the hospital, watching each other. Then one of the enemy soldiers stepped forward with his hands raised slightly, not in full surrender, but in a gesture that looked almost like hesitation. He shouted something across the distance, but Elena couldn't make out his words until he repeated them louder. He said they had wounded. He said they needed help. Elena gasped softly because the tone in his voice wasn't threatening. It was desperate. Commander Asher cursed under his breath, frustrated, torn. He didn't know how to respond. His men looked at him, waiting for an order. Some yelled for him to ignore the enemy. Others shouted that the request might be a trap. Elena stepped forward before she even realized she was moving. She told the commander that she needed to see them. She told him if they had wounded, they couldn't leave them to die. He argued that she would get herself killed, that she couldn't walk into enemy hands. But Elena refused to back down. The soldiers around her exchanged shocked looks. She raised her chin and said she had been saving everyone all day, and she wasn't going to stop now. She walked forward slowly, her hands lifted slightly to show she wasn't armed. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, her own soldiers behind her, the enemy soldiers ahead, all suspended in a strange silence. She reached the halfway point of the street and stopped. The enemy soldier who had spoken earlier stepped forward cautiously. He pointed behind him, where two more wounded men lay on the ground. Elena nodded and moved toward them. As she knelt beside the first one, she felt the tension in the air, a thick invisible rope connecting both sides, ready to snap at any moment. She kept her movements calm and deliberate, checking his breathing, assessing his injuries. She asked for water. One of the enemy soldiers hesitated, then passed her a bottle. She cleaned the man's wound, trying to stabilize him enough to transport. When she finished with the second soldier, she stood again, her hand stained with blood from both sides. She looked around and realized how quiet everything had become. The gunfire had completely stopped. It wasn't peace. It wasn't a truce. It was something fragile, something uncertain, but something different from the violence that had filled every hour of that day. Soldiers from both armies watched her with the same expression, a mixture of disbelief, respect, and confusion. They weren't sure whether to lower their weapons fully or keep them ready, so most held them loosely, somewhere between threat and surrender. Elena began walking back to the hospital, signaling the enemy soldiers to carry their wounded and follow her. Commander Asher looked stunned when he saw her approaching with men from both sides. Other soldiers backed away, unsure if they should allow them inside. Elena didn't wait for permission. She simply pointed toward empty beds and told the enemy soldiers to set their men down. Her voice had a firmness that no one dared challenge. For the first time since the war began, enemy uniforms appeared alongside her own inside the hospital walls, resting on beds only feet away from each other. Some soldiers stared angrily. Others watched silently, but none of them fired. None of them shouted. None of them raised a hand to stop her. Word spread quickly through both armies. The battlefield around the hospital fell into an uneasy stillness. Soldiers whispered to each other, pointing at the building, talking about the nurse who treated everyone the same. Someone from Elena's side dropped his weapon to help carry one of the enemy wounded. Someone from the other side lifted a stretcher for a local villager. It wasn't a ceasefire. It wasn't an agreement. But in that small space, around that fragile hospital, the fighting paused because of her. It was the first moment of humanity the battlefield had seen in months, created not by soldiers, not by commanders, not by negotiations, but by a single nurse who refused to let war decide who deserved to live. When the final hours of the battle slipped into the cold silence of early dawn, the field hospital looked like a place caught between life and death, where every breath from the wounded sounded like a fragile thread refusing to snap. Elena stood in the middle of it, exhausted, covered in dried blood, some hers, some from soldiers she couldn't save, and some from men who had begged her for help even as they clutched uniforms of the enemy. The strange thing was, she no longer saw the difference. The badges, the flags, the colors stitched to their sleeves. They meant nothing after months of watching the same fear in every pair of eyes she treated. And when she looked around at the silent rows of wounded men all waiting for what would happen next, she felt something shift deep inside her, something she had been holding together with sheer force of will for far too long. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion, the kind that sank into her bones and made every movement feel like dragging a heavy chain through mud. But the truth came to her slowly, like a whisper she could no longer ignore. The war wasn't ending tonight or tomorrow or even next week. It would keep taking and taking until nothing was left, not even her. She had lost people she cared about, seen friends disappear in explosions, and watched entire villages burn. And yet, even after all of that, she still stood here because walking away had always felt like abandoning someone who needed her. But now, as she listened to the faint groans coming from the tents and felt the cold wind brush against her bruised face, she realized that staying without a plan for the future would eventually break her in ways she could never repair. One of the wounded soldiers, a young man barely out of his teens, tried to sit up, and Elena hurried over to help him. His hands trembled as he clutched her wrist, as if searching for something steady in a world that had turned upside down. She whispered reassurance, her voice soft and steady, and for a moment he calmed, his breathing easing. But in that moment she also felt the truth sharpen inside her. She couldn't spend the rest of her life watching young men die in her arms. She wanted to live, not just survive, not just endure, actually live again, without the constant echo of artillery in her ears. When she stepped outside the tent to catch her breath, the first colors of dawn painted themselves across the horizon, soft oranges and pale blues blending with the fading smoke of distant fighting. A strange peace settled over her as she watched the sun rise over the battlefield, as if the world itself was reminding her that time still moved forward, no matter how many battles had been fought. She had no home to return to, not really. Her village was gone, her family scattered or lost. She had no guarantees waiting for her beyond these worn canvas tents. And yet, the uncertainty felt less frightening than staying here and slowly letting the war consume every last piece of her humanity. A faint crunch of footsteps behind her made her turn, and she saw Captain Earhart walking toward her, the same man whose life she had saved weeks earlier, despite the fact that he wore the uniform of the enemy. He had been keeping his distance since then, a quiet acknowledgement of the strange bond that had formed between them. Not friendship, not exactly, but something built from shared survival and unspoken gratitude. When he reached her, he didn't salute or speak with military formality. He simply looked at her like someone who understood what she was feeling without her saying a word. "You're thinking of leaving," he said, his tone gentle. Elena didn't answer right away. She stared at the horizon instead, watching the sunlight stretch across the ruined field. Eventually she nodded. "If I stay here, I don't know what will happen to me," she said softly. "I'm tired, Captain. Tired in a way I can't put into words." He didn't argue or try to convince her otherwise. Instead, he surprised her by saying, "Then leave before this place takes the rest of you." It was the first time she had heard him speak with something like urgency. "You've done more than enough. More than any soldier, any officer, any government ever could. You saved people on both sides. If anyone deserves a life after this, it's you." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not because they flattered her, but because they felt honest. For so long, she had carried the weight of believing she was responsible for everyone around her. Hearing someone tell her that it was okay to step away made her chest tighten with emotions she had pushed aside for months. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, letting the cold air steady her. "I don't know where to go," she admitted. "Then choose anywhere," he said. "Any place where you can finally rest." "Rest?" The word felt strange, almost foreign. She had forgotten what that even meant. She imagined a small town untouched by war, maybe near the coast or hidden in the mountains. A place where the loudest sound at night was the wind or the distant call of birds. A place where she could sleep without waking to the echo of explosions. A place where she wasn't a nurse surrounded by dying soldiers, but simply a woman with a future. When the final hours of the battle slipped into the cold silence of early dawn, the field hospital looked like a place caught between life and death, where every breath from the wounded sounded like a fragile thread refusing to snap. Elena stood in the middle of it, exhausted, covered in dried blood. Some hers, some from soldiers she couldn't save, and some from men who had begged her for help even as they clutched uniforms of the enemy. The strange thing was, she no longer saw the difference. The badges, the flags, the colors stitched to their sleeves. They meant nothing after months of watching the same fear in every pair of eyes she treated. And when she looked around at the silent rows of wounded men all waiting for what would happen next, she felt something shift deep inside her, something she had been holding together with sheer force of will for far too long. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion, the kind that sank into her bones and made every movement feel like dragging a heavy chain through mud. But the truth came to her slowly, like a whisper she could no longer ignore. The war wasn't ending tonight or tomorrow or even next week. It would keep taking and taking until nothing was left, not even her. She had lost people she cared about, seen friends disappear in explosions, and watched entire villages burn. And yet, even after all of that, she still stood here because walking away had always felt like abandoning someone who needed her. But now, as she listened to the faint groans coming from the tents and felt the cold wind brush against her bruised face, she realized that staying without a plan for the future would eventually break her in ways she could never repair. One of the wounded soldiers, a young man barely out of his teens, tried to sit up, and Elena hurried over to help him. His hands trembled as he clutched her wrist, as if searching for something steady in a world that had turned upside down. She whispered reassurance, her voice soft and steady, and for a moment he calmed, his breathing easing. But in that moment she also felt the truth sharpen inside her. She couldn't spend the rest of her life watching young men die in her arms. She wanted to live, not just survive, not just endure, actually live again, without the constant echo of artillery in her ears. When she stepped outside the tent to catch her breath, the first colors of dawn painted themselves across the horizon, soft oranges and pale blues blending with the fading smoke of distant fighting. A strange peace settled over her as she watched the sun rise over the battlefield, as if the world itself was reminding her that time still moved forward, no matter how many battles had been fought. She had no home to return to, not really. Her village was gone, her family scattered or lost. She had no guarantees waiting for her beyond these worn canvas tents. And yet, the uncertainty felt less frightening than staying here and slowly letting the war consume every last piece of her humanity. A faint crunch of footsteps behind her made her turn, and she saw Captain Earhart walking toward her, the same man whose life she had saved weeks earlier, despite the fact that he wore the uniform of the enemy. He had been keeping his distance since then, a quiet acknowledgement of the strange bond that had formed between them. Not friendship, not exactly, but something built from shared survival and unspoken gratitude. When he reached her, he didn't salute or speak with military formality. He simply looked at her like someone who understood what she was feeling without her saying a word. "You're thinking of leaving," he said, his tone gentle. Elena didn't answer right away. She stared at the horizon instead, watching the sunlight stretch across the ruined field. Eventually she nodded. "If I stay here, I don't know what will happen to me," she said softly. "I'm tired, Captain. Tired in a way I can't put into words." He didn't argue or try to convince her otherwise. Instead, he surprised her by saying, "Then leave before this place takes the rest of you." It was the first time she had heard him speak with something like urgency. "You've done more than enough. More than any soldier, any officer, any government ever could. You saved people on both sides. If anyone deserves a life after this, it's you." The words hit her harder than she expected, not because they flattered her, but because they felt honest. For so long, She had carried the weight of believing she was responsible for everyone around her. Hearing someone tell her that it was okay to step away made her chest tighten with emotions she had pushed aside for months. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, letting the cold air steady her. "I don't know where to go," she admitted. "Then choose anywhere," he said. "Any place where you can finally rest." Rest. The word felt strange, almost foreign. She had forgotten what that even meant. She imagined a small town untouched by war, maybe near the coast or hidden in the mountains. A place where the loudest sound at night was the wind or the distant call of birds. A place where she could sleep without waking to the echo of explosions. A place where she wasn't a nurse surrounded by dying soldiers, but simply a woman with a future. But as soon as the image formed, guilt tried to claw its way back into her heart. How could she leave when so many still needed help? How could she walk away when the wounded still looked at her with eyes full of hope? Captain Earhart must have seen the doubt on her face, because he stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Elena," he said, "if you stay out of guilt, you will lose the part of yourself that made you so important to them in the first place. You didn't save lives because you had to. You saved them because you still believed in something better. Don't let this war take that from you." She felt her throat tighten. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not since the war began. She had been praised, thanked, even saluted, but no one had ever cared about her as a person, only what she could do. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she wasn't defined by wounds and bandages and blood. A life where she could grow flowers, or teach children, or maybe just sit in a quiet cafe with a warm cup of tea and not feel the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. A soft breeze brushed through her hair, cool and gentle, and the rising sun warmed the side of her face. She took it as a sign, a small reminder that the world still held pieces of beauty even in the darkest times. She realized then that leaving wasn't selfish. It was necessary. She had given everything she had to this war, far more than anyone could have asked from her. And if she didn't stop now, she might never be able to rebuild the parts of herself that had been worn down over months of relentless suffering. Inside the tent, the wounded were beginning to stir, their voices rising in weak murmurs. Elena felt the familiar pull in her chest, the instinct to rush back inside and help. But instead, she let the moment stretch, breathing deeply as she held onto the fragile clarity forming inside her. When she finally looked back at Captain Earhart, her decision had settled quietly into place. "I'll leave tonight," she whispered. He nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, relief, maybe, or sadness. "If you need help getting out safely, I can arrange it." She shook her head gently. "You've done enough, and you have your own men to look after. But if you ever need a place to go," he said slowly, "you'll find me on the northern border when all this ends. I owe you my life. Remember that." She didn't promise anything, but she did give him a faint, grateful smile. Then she turned and walked back into the tent, knowing she would finish her shift, tend to the wounded one last time, and leave quietly under the cover of night. She didn't know what waited beyond the battlefield, but for the first time in a long while, the uncertainty no longer frightened her. It felt like freedom, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. And as she moved between the rows of injured soldiers, offering comfort and care, she carried with her the hope that somewhere outside this war-torn land, there was a future waiting for her that didn't depend on survival alone. Thanks for watching. If you loved this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more epic war tales. See you in the next video.